This is part two of the new Latin American authoritarianism. And here we're going to look at the case of Chile. Now, I corrected the slide, but not the audio. So just to be sure we all know that the Chilean dictatorship begins on September 11th, 1973, with the overthrow of Salvador Allende. And it led to a period of unbelievably intense, brutal repression. It's very different from the immediate aftermath of the Brazilian coup. There was political murder of activists and politicians, and society was really read as being at war with itself. And I think this is just so clear in this picture of the presidential palace being bombed by the Chilean Air Force. I mean, it's just such a horrible sight in a society that had a democracy. And this slide here was in the lecture on the overthrow of Allende. That the rounding up of political prisoners was really quite horrific. So the military runs the country, but there is one man in charge, and that is Augusto Pinochet. And he shut down the entire political system. He ruled in some ways as a traditional dictator, but on behalf of the military. So it's a different, slightly modified form of bureaucratic authoritarianism. And he wanted to kind of eradicate all radical politics, which is very hard in a country like Chile, where there'd been a popular front government, a very popularly elected socialist government by Allende, who kept winning midterm elections. And he wanted to shut the whole thing down. And he also decided that he was going to use dictatorial power to fundamentally alter the nature of the economy. And Pinochet very quickly turned to a kind of radical version of free market ideology. And in fact, there were Chilean businesses that suffered tremendously under Pinochet because they had been dependent on state aid and so forth. And they accepted this because they were worried so much about the radical nature of society, and all left-wing politics were all just lumped together as communism. So in order to fight communism, they were willing to suffer a bit to have this free market economy. A lot of it was directed by Chileans who had attended graduate school at the University of Chicago and worked with a guy named Milton Friedman, who was a real apostle of extreme free market economics. And so they were known throughout Chile as Los Chicago Boys because they all had the same kind of politics and believed very, very firmly in radical free market. But, you know, it's kind of interesting because one of the things they're most famous for was privatizing Social Security. What do we mean by that? Well, when you pay your Social Security tax, which on your payslip is FICA, you know, that's a government pension system. And they had a very similar system in Chile. But this is one where they privatized it. In other words, they took the government out of this and they forced everyone to have private accounts, which was a big boon to the banks and to the finance sector. But it really was a bad deal for most Chileans. And the reason we know that is that the military actually exempted itself. So they said, this is the best possible thing, private accounts, but we're going to have a state pension. So you can see that sometimes this veneer of full free market stuff was really just a veneer, that beneath the surface, there were winners and losers. But again, because it's a dictatorship, it's very hard to find beneath that surface because there's censorship and there's very little freedom of speech. Well, Pinochet had a very mixed record. I think a lot of people, a lot of conservatives around the world are very fond of talking about the great things that he did for the economy, but in fact, the record was quite mixed. By 1981, and after 8 years of rule, so this clearly is, him, the economy was shrinking. It wasn't growing. The Brazilians, during the period of torture and all that stuff, had a very robust economy, which took people's eyes off of the problems of torture, etc. Here you had an economy that was shrinking. It wasn't growing 1% or 2%. It was shrinking by 1 or 2% a year. It had the highest per capita debt in all of Latin America. It had extremely high unemployment. There was a skewing of income. In other words, the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. And of course, that showed up in things like high infant mortality rates. Now, again, this government, which claimed to be so laissez-faire, had to bail out the banking sector when it went bankrupt during the Latin American debt crisis. Now, Pinochet stayed in power in part because a huge segment of the population was very scared of all of the political, ferment of the Allende years, that there was too much going on that felt threatening, whether it was, peasants or workers or radical students. But after a while, many Chileans started to coalesce around the idea that, we're a democratic country and we deserve better than this. And what was interesting is that he started to increasingly lose the support of the middle class, which was really, if we think back to the lecture on the middle class in the 1930s, the key group. As the middle class went, they were going to, be with the winning side. And the middle class was increasingly put off by this. But there's another thing in there that's really important to get, is that Pinochet came to power with the full and vigorous support of Richard Nixon. And I think Pinochet would have come to power if Nixon were neutral. But Nixon was very in favor of him. And for years, the U.S. government, the Carter administration, promoted human rights and did not like Pinochet, but most governments supported him. And when Reagan came to power, Reagan was a very big supporter of Pinochet. But Reagan demanded that democracy be on the table in Latin America. And the reason he demanded it is that he was pushing very hard against dictatorship in Central America. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture. But what happened was a lot of Reagan's rhetoric about democracy was then turned back on Reagan by the U.S. State Department, who said, look, if we're going to push for democracy in Nicaragua and El Salvador, we have to push for democracy everywhere. And the Brazilians, and we'll talk about this in an upcoming lecture, were slowly becoming more democratic. We're opening and left power. The military left power in 1985. And so in 1986, 87, 88, the Reagan administration started to push on Pinochet and say, you really need to leave power. And they agreed that there would be a plebiscite, a simple election where people say we should continue a dictatorship or should return to democracy. And he thought he would win, but he lost. And in 1990, he stepped down because of popular class pressure, middle class pressure, and pressure from the United States. So what's the point of looking at these dictatorships, these military dictatorships that we call bureaucratic authoritarian? Well, the militaries in the 60s and 70s saw themselves as really the future of Latin American governance. They thought that Latin America would never be democratic and that populism was disorganized and a waste of time, and that, of course, communism they opposed. And they thought that technocratic solutions would allow them to govern themselves well. That getting politics out of the equation and just kind of looking at the data would answer it. But this was ultimately, it sounds good, but it's ultimately a terrible idea, because without politics, without the competing ideas, there's no oversight. There was lots of corruption. And, another word for politics is democracy, right? So interest groups demanding things, well, that's the democratic system. And what we're really saying is that the military and many people on the right in the 60s and 70s didn't like what it meant when previously excluded groups started to make claims on things. But there's actually a kind of seed of something really quite wonderful that comes out of these dictatorships. And that may sound odd until I explain what I mean. That the dictatorships themselves helped Latin America establish democracies. Militaries started leaving, and the Brazilians, this is very much the case, because they started to worry about their own institutional integrity. That when people were mad about the absence of democracy, they were mad at the military. They wanted the military to go away. The militaries, which saw themselves as these great nationalist institutions, were now targets of tremendous popular dissatisfaction. But there's something else that's going on, and that is, again, with the exception of Chile, there's very little democracy in Latin America before the late 20th century. But one of the things that these dictatorships did is it helped clarify that. In other words, during populism or previous eras of very narrow civilian rule, it was hard to think in terms of freedom and democracy. And now, when there was the complete absence of democracy, that clarified for people what freedom meant. And so many of the narratives of democracy that really are pushing open societies in the beginning in the late 1970s, certainly through the 80s and 90s, are all things that came out of opposition to the military. So opposition to the military wasn't always, there were a few examples of it being violent or lots of people in the street, but it became more of a rhetorical political stance that we want to get rid of dictatorship, and here's what we want to put in its place. Not a return to old-fashioned populism or narrow civilian rule, but real democracy in which everyone participates. And we're going to look in the final section of the class at how that happened and how important ways of thinking and acting democratically grew out of these bureaucratic authoritarian dictatorships.